"15 months out of recession, but not feeling like it."
Businesses are still slow to hire, and unemployment remains near 10%. But an economic research group reported this week that the recession in the United States ended in June of last year. It was the longest since the 1930s. James Stock is on the committee that dates the rises and falls in the business cycle for the National Bureau of Economic Research. The Harvard professor says this recession was in some ways a lot like others since World War II.
I think what I've been struck by is how these numbers basically look like all the other recessions we've had in the post-war period.
But one difference was the length, 18 months. Many recessions since the 1940s lasted less than a year. Another difference was the severity. The economy shrank by more than 4%. About 8 million people lost their jobs. Professor Stock thinks job growth is likely to increase in the coming months based on current levels of productivity.
I think that we are at a point right now where productivity has increased so much that for output to continue to grow, we will be seeing increases in hiring.
Some economic signs have improved. Manufacturing, industrial production, and consumer spending have made small gains. But a Labor Department report shows that new claims for unemployment insurance rose unexpectedly last week. On Monday, President Obama took questions at a meeting shown on CNBC television. One questioner wondered if today's young Americans still could hope for a good life.
What I'm really hoping to hear from you is several concrete steps that you're going to take moving forward that will be able to reignite my generation, reignite the youth who are beset by student loans. And I really want to know, is the American dream dead for me?
Absolutely not. Look, we still have the best universities in the world. We've got the most dynamic private sector in the world. We've got the most productive workers in the world. There is not a country in the world that would not want to change places with us.
But the economy could change the balance of power in Congress in the November elections. Critics say the president's economic stimulus programs have only put the country deeper in debt. Economists disagree about the extent to which the spending has helped. But many agree that the president's policies avoided a worse situation. Or, as Mr. Obama put it at the United Nations on Thursday, the global economy has been pulled back from the brink of a depression. In Washington, central bank policymakers said inflation remains low. In fact, they said it may be too low to support their aims for price and wage stability. And Lawrence Summers, director of the President's National Economic Council, said he will leave at the end of the year to return to Harvard University.
Why development projects fail. One size does not fit all.
Last week, we told you about Fail-Fair, an event where people talk about international development projects that failed. Many of these projects started as good ideas. Others had some level of success, but not enough to have a measurable effect on the lives of people in developing countries. A nonprofit group in New York called Mobile Active held the first Fail-Fair earlier this year. Mobile Active is made up of people and organizations that use technology to try to improve the lives of the poor. Katrine Verklaas came up with the idea for Fail-Fair as a way to help nonprofit groups improve by learning from the mistakes of others.
The primary goal is to learn from failure and not to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And for a community of practitioners to benefit from the lessons learned from other people so that we can do better the next time around, collectively as a field and individually as organizations and practitioners.
Katrien Verklas says there are many reasons why projects fail, but one reason tops all others. She says development projects are not one-size-fits-all, yet many people try to import ideas as if they were. What they fail to consider, she says, is the desires of the local people or their cultural, economic, and political differences. She says the problem for many non-governmental organizations and other groups is simply not knowing their audience.
Western organizations or NGOs or donors in particular have particular ideas about what might be alleviating a particular problem in a developing country without really good understanding of the end users or the beneficiaries.
The creator of Failfair says this is true not only with technology, but other projects as well. Ms. Verklas hopes nonprofits in other industries and fields will create their own versions of Failfair. A second Failfair took place in July in Washington. The World Bank Institute co-sponsored the event. To Katrien Verklas, it was a good sign to have the World Bank support such open discussions about failure.
We have a lot riding on this, after all. It's not just products. It's people's lives and well-being and livelihoods in many developing countries that we're talking about. So it's incumbent upon us to be very, very honest about what projects aren't performing according to expectations.
An award for the best worst failure story went to Michael Trucano from the World Bank Institute. What he presented was, in fact, a list. It was a list of what he considers the worst practices in the use of information and communication technologies in education. Mr. Trucano gets to keep the award until the next Failfair, which is expected to be held on the West Coast this fall.
Basel plan aims to force banks to increase capital.
The financial crisis of 2008 brought attention to a big problem with banks. Many banks did not have enough money in reserve to protect against their losses. Now there is a proposed solution. On Sunday, banking supervisors from 26 nations and Hong Kong met in Basel, Switzerland. They announced proposals to make banks safer by requiring them to increase their reserves. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision has been working on a set of recommendations known as Basel III. These are based on agreements reached in July by officials from a group of leading industrial nations. The goal is to stop the cycle of easing rules on banks in good times and tightening them only after a crisis. Under the new rules, banks would have to hold reserves equal to 7% of their risk-weighted assets. Mainly, this means loans. Currently, banks are required to hold 2% in reserve. The bigger reserves could be in the form of cash or common stock, also known as common equity. Banks would also have to hold extra reserves as their national economies improve. The new requirements would go into effect starting in January of 2013. Banks would have 5 years to fully meet them. International banking lawyer Ernie Patrikas, a former vice president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, explains why.
We cannot be telling banks, on the one hand, raise capital right away, and on the other hand, lend more.
Economic growth remains slow in much of the developed world. The worry is that any decrease in lending could hurt a global recovery. One way for banks to meet the proposed new rules would be to sell more of their stock. That is what Germany's Deutsche Bank did last week. It announced a sale offer valued at over $11 billion. Ernie Patrikas thinks chief executive officers of banks have three choices.
One is to go out and raise more common equity. Another one is not pay dividends. And that's not something that most CEOs want to do because their shareholders aren't going to be particularly happy. And the third choice is sell assets, downsize the bank.
Nations on the Basel Committee will now seek to pass the new rules into law so their banking supervisors can enforce them. Banks that fall below the reserve limits could have to stop paying dividends to shareholders or bonuses to top employees. Ending dividends would anger shareholders, and limiting pay could send bankers fleeing to hedge funds where there are fewer rules.
Getting NGOs to celebrate failure so they can learn from others' mistakes.
Week after week, we bring you stories about projects to improve lives in the developing world. Projects like banking by mobile phone, or low-cost lighting systems, or even a toilet bag that recycles itself into fertilizer. But for every success story, there are countless other projects that failed. These are the stories that people talk about at an event called Fail Fair. The creators of the event recently held their second Fail Fair. Members of the nonprofit community came together in Washington to talk about their projects and why they failed. Fail Fair is sort of like a celebration of failure. A prize is even given to the best worst story. But why celebrate? Katrine Verklaas is with a nonprofit group in New York called Mobile Active. She was the one with the idea for Fail Fair. She says the event provides an opportunity for people to learn from the mistakes of others.
Development is a field with finite resources. And so the less money we waste, the better. And part of that is learning from the things that didn't work so that we don't endlessly repeat them.
Mobile Active held its first Fail Fair in New York earlier this year. More than 70 people attended the event. One of them, for example, was there to talk about his failed nonprofit organization, mobileimpact.org. Bradford Frost had hoped to recycle used cell phones and provide them to people in Africa. Katrine Verklaas explains some of the problems with this project and others like it.
It didn't work at all, given the prevalence of cheap, very inexpensive handsets in the countries. We often refer to that as sweeto, stuff we don't want. The old stuff that we have that we think we can hand down to developing countries. And that's not a very sustainable or, in many ways, smart approach.
Fail Fair takes place in a light-hearted social setting over food and drinks. Ms. Verklaas says the creator of a project is the one responsible for declaring it a failure. She says profit-making businesses talk more about failure than nonprofit organizations do.
We have to report to donors, and donors do not like to look bad. And so we don't like to look bad as nonprofits. And so we have a tendency to highlight our successes and never talk about our failures.
Katrine Verklaas says she hopes Fail Fair will change this problem over time. She says members of the nonprofit community have been surprisingly open to her idea. Join us again next week for more about Fail Fair and who won the award for Best Worst Story.
Obama urges steps to strengthen economy.
This week, President Obama proposed new measures to lift the economy. The central bank, in its latest report, said there was continued growth in the past several weeks, but with widespread signs of slowing. Congressional elections are November 2nd. One new survey showed that 49% of likely voters think Republicans should control Congress. Other polls find that about 60% of Americans think the country is going in the wrong direction. President Obama gave a speech Wednesday near Cleveland, Ohio. He proposed a tax plan for businesses that make capital improvements, like buying new equipment.
And I'm proposing that all American businesses should be allowed to write off all the investment they do in 2011. And this will help small businesses upgrade their plants and equipment, and will encourage large corporations to get off the sidelines and start putting their profits to work in places like Cleveland and Toledo and Dayton.
Mr. Obama also proposed to permanently extend a tax credit for research and development. And on Monday, he offered a plan for rebuilding and modernizing America's roads, rails, and runways. He said it would create jobs and improve transportation. The plan would cost $50 billion, but he promised it would not add to the budget deficit over time. The president spoke in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Both speeches were in the Midwest, an area hit hard by the recession. He said almost every Republican in Congress is saying no to his ideas. But retiring Senator George Voinovich of Ohio tells the Washington Post that he plans to help push a bill through the Senate next week. That bill, supported by the president, contains measures to help small businesses. Still, there is disagreement over the future of the tax cuts approved under President George W. Bush. These are set to end this December. President Obama wants to extend the tax cuts for families that earn less than $250,000 a year. But John Boehner of Ohio, the Republican minority leader in the House of Representatives, told ABC News,
"You can't have a strong economy if you're raising taxes on the very people you expect to invest in our economy to begin hiring people again."
Republicans oppose ending the tax cuts for higher earners. They say it would hurt small businesses. Democrats argue that few small businesses earn enough for their taxes to go up. Congress passed a big stimulus bill shortly after the president took office last year. But there is little that his newest proposals could do to help the economy before November.
How to get the most from a complaint letter.
And this week on Wordmaster, a lesson in complaining.
English teacher Lita Baker is with us from Los Angeles to discuss a topic suggested by one of our listeners, an English teacher in Iran. His students would like to know the proper way to complain.
Lita Baker says the first part of any complaint is a factual statement about what the problem is. But there's another part to learn that's more important, she says.
I'm guessing that there are students from a lot of cultures where this cultural behavior we have in the United States of being very forthright about what we think and what we want, that's the part that would be a lot harder for them than the linguistic part of complaining, which is just saying, here's the problem.
It's legitimate in the United States to complain. It's legitimate to take a product back to a store, and I think this is something that a student would have to understand before he or she could actually put the complaint into action. But Lita, how would you put this into context in a classroom? How would you teach? I guess it would be kind of an assertiveness training.
I think in teaching, the first step is providing that cultural background. What is the return policy of a store? And understanding that it isn't the same from one store to the next. I mean, I had an incident a few weeks ago where I bought some clothes for my daughter from a store where I just assumed that if they didn't fit her, because she wasn't with me at the time, I just assumed that if they didn't fit, I could bring them back. And they didn't fit, and I went back to the store, and to my utter surprise, this store would not refund my money. It would only give me a store credit or allow for an exchange. And I was very shocked because I was used to shopping in stores that provided you with a full refund for your money.
What did you say to the clerk? I'm curious. How did you handle that?
I expressed my surprise, but at the same time I reminded myself that this is not, the clerks are the people in the first line of fire, but we have to remember that they're not the ones who set the store policy.
You know what? I have here an example of a complaint letter. This is on the Sarasota, Florida Public School System's website, and it was written to this clothing company. And this is a letter about some shoes, and it begins, "To whom it may concern. On September 20th, I ordered by phone a pair of brown leather piece mules for $36.99, which included $4.99 for shipping and handling. When they were delivered to my home, the package was wet and the leather shoes were ruined. I am returning the shoes. I realize the shipping and handling fee is non-refundable, but I would like the original amount of $32 to be refunded. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Sincerely," and she signs it here. So what do you think of that?
I think that's a perfect letter of complaint. She states what the problem is. She states what correction she would like the company to make. The tone is neutral. She doesn't come across as angry or demanding. It's short. There's nothing extra there, so that the person reading the letter doesn't have to go hunting, through the letter. What is it that happened and what does the person want? And getting back to the classroom now, if we wanted to give our students experience learning how to write letters of complaint, we would show them several examples. We would then give them a situation in which there was something to complain about, and we would ask them to write a similar letter using one of the models that we've provided, like the one that you just read. What is much harder, of course, is for people to get experience complaining verbally, in person. And so once we have demonstrated by means of either video or literature several scenarios in which complaining takes place, and we've analyzed the language and the structures that go into complaining, the final step, and perhaps the most important one, is to give students practice complaining in a sheltered environment. In other words, in the classroom. And I would do that by means of role-playing.
Lita Baker teaches English and writes textbooks in Los Angeles, California.
Do it yourself, how to dry or smoke fish, Part 2.
Today we have the second of two reports explaining how to prepare fish by drying or smoking them. We talked last week about the first steps of cleaning and salting freshly caught fish. To dry fish, you will need either a drying table or a place to hang them. If a table is used, it should have a top made of wire screen or thin pieces of wood with space between each piece. Lay the cleaned and salted fish, still wet, on the table. Do not let them touch each other. Be sure that air can flow around the fish from all sides, including the top and bottom. Build a small, smoky fire under the drying table for the first day to keep the flies away. After that, you can keep the flies away by covering the fish with a thin cloth. Do not let the cloth touch the fish. Fish taste better if they are out of bright sunlight while they are being dried. For best results, put the drying table under a tree. Turn the fish over every other day. Small fish will dry in about 3 days if the air is dry. Large fish will take a week or 10 days to dry. After the fish have dried, place them in a basket. Cover them with a clean paper or large leaves. Then put the basket in a cool, dry place off the ground. Make sure as much of the salt water as possible is removed before you smoke the fish. The smoking can be done in a large, round metal container. Remove the top of the drum and cut a small opening on one side at the bottom. Cover the top with a strong wire screen. This is where you put the fish. Build a small fire in the drum by reaching in through the opening at the bottom. Wood from fruit trees makes good fuel for your fire. The wood will give the smoked fish good color and taste. Hardwoods such as hickory, oak, and ash also burn well. It is important to keep the fire small so it does not burn the fish. You want a lot of smoke, but very little flame. One way to get a lot of smoke is to use green wood, not dried wood. You should smoke the fish for 5 days or longer if you plan to store them for a long time. After you finish smoking the fish, remove them and let them cool. Then wrap them in clean paper. Put the fish in baskets and keep them in a cool, dry place off the ground. Dried fish must be kept completely dry until they are eaten.